Originating in the Scandinavian starting zone, the Viking class received a massive buff in the late 8th century balance patch, which allowed them to dominate well into the 11th century. The Vikings emerged as a formidable force, reshaping the meta of their time. Known for their unique character builds, specializing in seafaring and raiding, these northern warriors ventured beyond their starting zone, leaving a lasting impact on the server. The Viking faction boasted unique gameplay mechanics. Their longships, masterfully crafted for speed and agility, were more than mere vessels. They were tools that expanded the Vikings' exploration and raiding quests, allowing them to access and influence distant realms. In the PvP arenas of Europe, the Viking players deployed strategies that were both methodical and ruthless. Their raids, often seen as high-stake missions, were carefully planned to maximize loot and influence, solidifying their reputation as fearsome adversaries. These encounters were not just random skirmishes, but calculated moves in a complex game of power and survival. Today we're going to go over the 8th to 11th century balance patches to understand how and why the Viking class distinguished themselves and changed the meta through their early, mid, and late game builds, their skill sets, adaptability, strategic gameplay, and the overall influence that they left on the server. From the innovation of their longships, to their legendary PvP encounters, to their trade routes, and their armors and weapons of choice, the saga of the Vikings is a tale of conquest, exploration, and strategic mastery. The Viking build was a fine-tuned combination of various skill trees, and primarily their seafaring skills were unmatched. The Viking players invested heavily into their naval tech tree, unlocking longships that were marvels of the era. These ships are not just transport vessels, they were key assets in their raiding and exploration quests, and it's because of their harsh starting zone, a landscape carved by rivers and fjords, that they were able to carve out a niche with this very unique build. During the early game, new Viking players honed their skills in ship handling, using the waterways for fishing and travel, which laid the foundation for their future as unparalleled sailors. Designed specifically for speed, agility, and versatility, these ships were not just tools for exploration, they were formidable weapons of war. In a raid, these vessels could swiftly approach a target, be hauled onto a beach, allowing the raiders to disembark and engage in combat almost instantaneously. Equipped with both sails and oars, these ships were designed for multiple modes of propulsion. Their light construction and shallow draft meant that they could navigate both the open seas and shallow rivers with ease, a tactical advantage that very few other factions could match.
They have ships that can cross the oceans, but also sail up rivers. What manner of men are these?
Maxing out their longship tech tree made their designs revolutionary. Faster, lighter, and more flexible than their contemporaries, Viking longships dominated the open waters. It was this tech tree paired with their maxed out seafaring skill is what made them such a formidable force, and their ability to use these ships for both military and economic purposes not only facilitated their infamous raids, but also established them as a dominant power in the trade networks of their time. Now, contrary to popular belief and media depiction, the Viking faction didn't just excel in raids and PvP. Their character class was much more complex, encompassing the roles of explorers, traders, and raiders. This multifaceted build was a result of their strategic allocation of skill points, maximizing their seafaring abilities to enhance their trade and exploration stats. Navigation was a critical skill in the Viking toolbelt. They learned how to read the stars and use landmarks to navigate during their exploration quests. These techniques allowed them to traverse vast and treacherous waters, venturing far beyond their starting zone and reaching destinations that were thought to be beyond the reach of their time. Viking expeditions were legendary. Their trade routes extended from the British Isles to Kiev and Rus, and even as far as Baghdad in the Islamic server and Arctic North America. These journeys weren't just for conquest. They were quests for knowledge, resources, and new trading opportunities. The Vikings were very astute and resourceful players, using their versatile longships as key assets in establishing expansive trade networks. They traded a variety of goods with other players and factions, from whale skins and walrus ivory used in shipbuilding and carving, to luxury items like silks and spices from distant lands. Their reach even extended to Istanbul and Jerusalem, trading for things like glass, spices, and silks. Their ability to adapt and thrive in different roles showcased their versatility and strategic depth, making them a very dynamic and influential faction. The Viking players built up a reputation for being violent savages during the 9th century balance patch, but this didn't happen in a peaceful vacuum. During this era, there was constant back and forth PvP events, so Viking players weren't exactly exceptional for their savagery. In fact, they would have been exceptional if they hadn't have been so savage. The real reason they got this reputation during this time was because they were without a doubt exceptionally good at what they did. Common early game raids for the Viking players was Christian monasteries. The reason for this approach wasn't due to any particular hostility towards Christianity, but instead it's because there was a lot of unprotected loot stored inside of these monasteries and other religious centers.
Why would they leave such treasures unprotected? Is there some spell or some magic which protects them?
It appears not.
This strategy was perfect for leveling up quickly, and the Viking players perfected this grind by showing up at coastal towns and monasteries suddenly and without warning, loot anything and everything they could get their hands on, and vanish in their ships before the local military forces could mobilize against them. You see, monasteries were perfect for new players to hit because they were full of valuables, such as silver, gold, and jewels. They were also isolated, which meant that it didn't really take much effort to sneak up and attack them quickly, and they had virtually no defense, as the monks and priests didn't really put up much of a fight. Using the loot that they gathered from these early game raids, the Viking players were able to expand their armies and gear up for the mid-game, facing enemies who were much harder to take on and more prepared for a battle. These raids were no walk in the park, as the enemies put up a good fight by adapting to their tactics and bolstering up their defenses, by building fortified bridges to deny the raiders access to inland waterways, building ships to meet them in the battle before they stepped foot ashore, and fortifying their settlements. Compared to the early game raids that generally took place in the summer events, these tougher raids lasted well into the winter, with the Viking players often overwintering in the lands they pillaged, and eventually conquering those lands where they became permanent settlers on their quest to expand their territory and attempt the endgame raids. Compared to the hit-and-run tactics with virtually no resistance in this early game, the endgame events like the Battle of Stamford Bridge were on a whole different level. This raid in particular was the largest scale PvP battle fought in Viking history, with the Viking faction rallying over 9,000 players against the kingdoms of England and Norway, with their own massive 12,000 player strong armies. The Viking players excelled in hand-to-hand combat in many ways, and their weapons of choice were a big one. In the Viking faction's armory, the distribution of weapons was a clear indicator of a warrior's level and status. Swords, with their intricate craftsmanship and high resource demand, were paired with high-end gear, accessible only to high-level endgame players. These weapons were not just tools of war, they symbolized prestige and power within the Viking community. The crafting of a sword was an expensive endeavor, requiring significant amounts of iron and skilled labor.
The iron is stronger. Better than ours.
This made swords a luxury, often reserved for the most successful and affluent warriors. Possessing a sword was a sign of high status, and these weapons were frequently passed down as treasured family heirlooms. Now in contrast, the spear was a fundamental weapon in the Viking arsenal, valued for its simplicity, effectiveness, and practicality. Producing a spear did not require a high level of skill or quality materials needed for sword making. Spears were cost-effective, requiring less steel, and could be crafted from lower quality materials while still maintaining their effectiveness. This made them an accessible weapon for the majority of the Viking population and perfect for new players. The spear's design is one of the oldest and most basic in human history, yet its effectiveness in combat was undeniable. Learning to wield a spear was far less demanding than mastering a sword or axe, making it a suitable weapon for those Vikings who were not professional soldiers but needed to defend their homes or join raids. In combat, the spear proved to be a superior weapon, especially when paired with a shield. The practicality of the spear also extended to logistics. Viking players could easily transport multiple spearheads on their longboats, with shafts being crafted from available wood during their voyages. This meant that a Viking warrior could carry a few spearheads and quickly fashion new spears as needed, which was a significant advantage during the extended campaigns. The spear, in its simplicity and effectiveness, was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of the Viking players' adaptability and resourcefulness. Whether in defense of their homelands or on raids across the seas, the spear remained as a reliable and trusted tool in a warrior's journey. The axe was the weapon that Vikings were most known for, defining their culture and warfare. Its primary advantage lay in its multifunctional utility. Axes were integral to daily Viking life, used for a range of tasks, from training their woodcutting skills to building. This constant use in everyday activities meant that the Vikings developed a natural proficiency with the axe, seamlessly translating the skill to the battlefield. From a resource standpoint, the axe was more accessible than the sword, requiring less iron and time to craft. It was a cost-effective weapon, making it available to a broader range of players, including those of lower levels. This accessibility turned the axe into the standard weapon of the Viking warrior class. The versatility of the axe made it an ideal starter weapon for new players, while its effectiveness in combat ensured its continued use by high-level warriors. It was a weapon that scaled with the player, adaptable to various combat scenarios and skill levels. Now, Viking players were at their best when fighting in close quarters, so they sacrificed some of their shield's defensive bonuses by making their shields out of wood to be light, and making it round because the shape is agile and easy to maneuver while being gripped from its center. And while it's true that they did lose some of their defensive bonuses from this design, it in turn boosted their offense greatly by doubling as a weapon itself when needed, which complemented their aggressive playstyle really well. The effectiveness of the shield can be attributed to the simplicity of its design. Wood was the preferred material for creating the shields, as it was a cheap and plentiful resource unlike iron, and although the Viking shield would not be able to withstand a direct, head-on strike from a sword, mace, or spear, they were designed to deflect and lessen the impact of weapon blows. Instead of absorbing the impact of the enemy's blow, the shield instead redistributed and dispersed the force throughout the large surface area and player's body, which reduced shock and injury. But this iconic round shield was not just used passively at the expense of offense, but in conjunction with weapons, and it provided protection while not hindering the free movement of the warrior's weapon hand. And because it was so light, the shield could also be transferred from one hand to the other in a moment of need during a fight on the battlefield. It could even be used to charge at an opponent in a moment of desperation to knock them off balance. Now, another thing the shield was used for was the premium cash shop cosmetics. You see, instead of customizing one's character with store-bought cosmetics, the players instead chose to customize their shields. Shields were often personalized, reflecting the individual warrior's identity, beliefs, and ambitions. Some of the many cosmetics players used included loops, geometric patterns, animal shapes, and occasionally even mythological scenes like the Valknut or the Yggdrasil tree. Among these personalized designs, color is what played the biggest role. It wasn't just there for aesthetic appeal, but also to convey deeper symbolism and meanings. The choice of color was not random, and each hue had a unique significance. For example, a black-colored shield symbolized death or loss and might have been used by those who sought revenge. Blue was thought to be used by those who revered the sea gods. Yellow, representing gold, was chosen by warriors who sought wealth and prosperity. And red, the most common color found on Viking shields, symbolized power, war, and bloodshed. It could even be argued that some of these cosmetics might have given players an in-game advantage, as certain colors, like red for example, could help them out on the battlefield. I mean, think about it. It must have been terrifying to see a Viking ship with a row of red shields on each side landing on your coast. A sight like that could cause a panic and result in poor performance during PvP due to the mental mind games. And thus, the round shield was more than just a piece of equipment. It was a symbol of the Viking player's approach to warfare, adaptable, resourceful, and always ready for the challenges of the battlefield. And all in all, it was a pretty versatile tool in the Vikings' arsenal. Because the Vikings were so successful in their aggressive playstyle, they had many enemies. And among the many hard-fought battles and raids, there were several factions that played key roles during the Vikings' rise to power. These factions, each with their own unique builds and strategies, frequently clashed with the Viking players, creating a very dynamic and often volatile PvP environment. First among these were the Franks, a powerful faction controlling much of what is now France and Germany. The strength of the Franks lay in their cavalry. These were the predecessors of medieval knights, a class of aristocratic armored warriors charging into battle as coordinated groups. They were the heavy hitters of the European server, and to face them was to be trampled beneath the hooves of the future of warfare. The Franks' build was characterized by a strong central government, advanced military organization, and a very rich cultural heritage. They were the primary enemies of the Vikings in the first few seasons of the game, and engaged in numerous battles with them throughout the 9th century balance patch. Before the Vikings got their buffs, the Frankish Empire stood as a colossus, a faction of immense power and influence. The Franks controlled a vast territory that encompassed much of what is now France and Germany, and their strengths lay not just in their expansive lands, but in their sophisticated political and military systems. Their military was one of the most advanced of the era, equipped with well-trained soldiers and innovative tactics. This made them a very formidable opponent for any factions, including the Vikings. The Viking players, attracted by the wealth of the Frankish monasteries and towns, frequently targeted their territories. However, they soon found that raiding the Frankish lands was no easy feat, as they faced a well-organized and determined high-level enemy. Key battles between the Vikings and the Franks marked this period of conflict, such as the Siege of Paris PvP event of 845, where guild leader Ragnar attacked with 120 Viking ships containing more than 5,000 players. This event in particular was so popular that the devs eventually brought it back for a rerun 3 times in the 860s balance patch and again in 885. The ongoing clashes between the Franks and Vikings were not just military engagements. They were a clash of cultures, strategies, and ambitions that shaped the course of the European server forever. Across the channel, in the lands now known as England, were the Anglo-Saxons. This faction was a collection of various kingdoms, each with its own guild leader and army. The Anglo-Saxons were another frequent target of Viking raids, and their battles with the Vikings were numerous and fierce, spanning across the 9th and 10th balance patches. Originating from the Germanic tribes, they migrated to the Britain zone post-Roman Empire, establishing a network of kingdoms, each with their unique stats and abilities. The Anglo-Saxon build was primarily rural, focusing on farming and artisan skills, but they were no strangers to PvP combat. Their legal system, a set of well-defined rules and penalties, laid the foundation for future gameplay mechanics in English common law. Initially following a pagan skill tree, they later on specced into Christianity, significantly altering their cultural and societal attributes. The Viking raids began to challenge the Anglo-Saxon guilds in the late 8th century. These raids were marked by quick, brutal strikes against key resource points, forcing the Anglo-Saxons to level up their defense strategies. King Alfred the Great, a legendary player in the Wessex zone, emerged as a pivotal raid boss against the Viking players. His strategic prowess and cultural achievements were game changers, culminating the Battle of Edington, a critical PvP event where he successfully repelled the Viking raiders. The importance of Alfred's victory cannot be exaggerated, as it prevented the Viking players from becoming masters of the England region. The aftermath of this battle led to the Treaty of Wedmore and the establishment of the Daneclaw, which was a unique co-op zone where the Vikings and Anglo-Saxon players interacted under different rule sets. This era marked a significant shift in the game's meta, where cultural exchange and integration of these two factions became key elements of gameplay.
You have helped me in my conquest for Mercia, and I have helped you to establish a settlement in the very heart of my kingdom.
PvP encounters such as these show us that even though the Viking players were feared, it didn't mean that they were unstoppable. Sure, their ability to strike swiftly from the sea, combined with their combat skills and aggressive playstyle, made them quite a formidable force, but they still faced their share of struggle during their conquest. As we analyze the historical server, it's clear that the Viking faction left a lasting impact on the meta. Their raids, settlements, and cultural exchanges significantly influenced the regions they touched, from the British Isles to the coasts of the Mediterranean and beyond. The Vikings' legacy is evident in various aspects of modern culture. Their language contributed to the development of several European languages, their artistic styles influenced regional art, and their genetic legacy can still be traced in many populations today. They also reshaped the cultural and political landscapes of the regions they interacted with, leaving a mark that transcends centuries. So, were the Vikings OP? Well, they certainly had a strong early and mid game, seen by the successful raids and expansive influence, and their advancements in technology, governance, and culture suggest a faction that was ahead of its time. And while yes, they were exceptionally formidable in combat, their true power lay in their ability to influence and integrate into various cultures, reshaping the meta in more ways than one. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you next time.